What is the most common STD? And you know what? The top 6, probably half of them, you don't even know anything about, or possibly all of them. Here are the top 6. Chlamydia. Just in the United States, this is just the United States, 2.8 million every year get chlamydia. Genital herpes, 1 million a year. It's called HSV, genital herpes. And there's no cure for it, no cure. 40-some million Americans have it and there's no cure. Crabs, ooh, doesn't that sound awful? Pelvic lice. I wanted to have a picture to put up, but it's so, it's so ugly. I couldn't even put it up in the video. It's so bad. But think of this, 3 million people a year get crabs or pelvic lice, just in the United States. Trichomoniasis, I don't know exactly how you pronounce that one. I call it trickle. 7 million a year. Of HIV, 46,000. HPV, human papillomavirus, 6 million a year. Now, the Centers for Disease Control, which is probably the #1 organization in the world in infectious disease, says that HPV, human papillomavirus, is the #1 sexually transmitted disease in the United States and the world. Even though trichomoniasis, there's 7 million, but it'll vacillate between 5 and 7 million. But the reason they say the 6 million with HPV is #1, because with trichomoniasis, it's quite easily to cure it. There is no cure for HPV. Most of you here probably doesn't even know what it means or anything. #1 sexually transmitted disease, HPV. At UCLA Medical School, they said there is no cure for it. There is no cure. In fact, you know what? There's no test you can take. You only see it by the symptoms. You can't go get a wedding, marriage thing to see if you have it or not. And it stays concealed about 10 to 12 years in the human body. There's this real popular TV show, and I think it's all over the world, called Law and Order. Last night I was watching it, Law and Order, and there was an African-American lady who's the lieutenant, you know, runs the office kind of hardcore, and she got real soft and everything else. It's been leading up for a few shows, and she finally went to the doctor, took tests, and they said, you have cancer, pelvic or cervix cancer. You're HPV infected. That's what caused it. And she says, well, I can't be. I've only known this man, this wonderful man, for 1 year, 1 month. And when he said, I'm sorry, then you could have had it for years. Well, I haven't been married for 5 years. And she stops, says, that blankety blank, he gave me HPV. And she just now found out on it. Boy, just in America, I want you overseas to understand every country, just in the United States, 20 million Americans have HPV. Now here's what you have to understand. HPV in the last 5 years has killed more women than HIV and AIDS. You don't even know anything about it, do you? Isn't that amazing? Killing more women than HIV and AIDS, and women don't even know anything about it. #1 sexually transmitted disease, and there is no cure. 20 million Americans have it. 6.2 million Americans every year is infected. Multiply that out. 50% of all sexually active who have ever had sex one time will be infected. Whew. And nobody's talking about it. Of U.S. women infected with HPV, just women right now, is 26.8% of the entire women's population. And nobody's talking about it. And it's killing more women than HIV and AIDS. And it's passed on 10 times faster. It's 10 times more efficient than AIDS and HIV. Everybody's talking about HIV. It's HPV that's killing people, and nobody talks about it. And it's passed on just like that, and you don't even know you have it for 10, 12, 14 years. 98 to 99%, no symptoms. Now, if you have a very strong health system in your body, it will often fight it off. A good percentage of it will, without you even knowing it, your body will take care of it. But it's that large percentage that will never leave your body that does the unbelievable damage. But this is what's amazing. In Canada, this would probably be true of any country of the world, 90% of Canadian teenagers, probably just like China, American, Germany, France, everywhere, said they're very knowledgeable about sex. Only 19% had even heard of HPV. Only 20% knew cancer was one of the consequences of HPV. Only 20%. And it's the same thing with teenagers all over the world. They think they're so smart, so loud, I know all this. In reality, young people, you don't know hardly anything when it comes to sexually transmitted diseases. Most of you have never even known how your brain works, operates, what bonds you to somebody else, what gives you that thrill, that excitement, how to control it, which we'll look at. It's just mind-boggling.
For about 9 years, I counseled in crisis pregnancy centers in Minneapolis. And for 9 years, I would have girls in my office every day saying, Pam, I didn't know. If someone would have told me that this is what was going to happen to me, I would have made a different choice. And I started to realize that there were a lot of students out there who were making the really tough choices about sex, having absolutely no idea what the consequence of that choice would be. I mean, the media shows them, oh, well, you can just jump in, have sex with this person or that person. No one gets herpes. No one ends, well, you might see a teen pregnancy, but they kind of shove it to the side. And the reality is that when you make a decision to have sex outside of a monogamous relationship, outside of marriage, there will always be a cost. It was just sad that so many of these students didn't fully understand the price that they were paying.
Now, HPV virus, it's a virus, that's why there's no cure. But how many different HPV viruses, which you'd say different diseases, how many different HPV viruses are there? 40? 80? 100? 120? How many of you think there's 40 different viruses? 80 different viruses? 100 different HPV viruses? You must think there's 120? 100 different HPV viruses. 40 of them causes genital sexual infection. 40 of them. 18 are high risk for cancer. Under these 130 are sexually transmitted. Whew. You take the 25, add this, you could actually say there's 125 sexually transmitted diseases. That's staggering. Another question. What percentage of women will have HPV by the age of 50? 25%? 35%? 50%? 72%? 50%. Of all women, by the time they're 50, will be HPV infected. And there's no cure. It's killing more women than HIV and AIDS. What percentage of sexually active men will get HPV? 50%? Whoa, that's starting off big. 70%, 80%, 90%. 70%. Imagine if someone you think a lot of is sexually involved. What are the chances of them having an STD? 20%? 30%? 40%? 50%? What do you think, Michelle?
40%.
Almost 50. Just look at your friends. You have 5 friends, 2.5 of them are infected. And all of them think they're so smart they'll beat the odds. It's always somebody else. I can play around and beat the odds. No. In my book, I pretty well prove you'll never play around and beat the odds outside of a loving commitment of marriage. The statistics are totally against you. But everyone thinks, I can go to Las Vegas and walk away with more money, when 94% walk away with less money than they ever came. And there. How many will get an STD today? 52,000, just Americans. Yesterday, 52,000. Tomorrow, 52,000. Day after tomorrow, 52,000. That's 108,000 in 4 days. You won't beat the odds.
Usually, you know, I would have girls come into my crisis pregnancy center for a pregnancy test, and they're scared to death, and their biggest fear is that they might be pregnant. So one of the biggest myths that students believe is that the only thing that could happen if they have sex outside of marriage is they could get pregnant. And I would come in and I would do a negative pregnancy test and look at this young girl and say, hey, your test is negative. And she'd be like, well, thank goodness, you know, this big look of relief. She's ready to leave my clinic. And I'm like, wait a minute. Have you been tested for syphilis, gonorrhea, herpes, chlamydia, trichomonas, vulvodynia, arthritis, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HPV, HIV? Have you been tested for these things? And she's like, you know, me? Well, I didn't think I would need to be tested for that. And the reality is you're in here for a pregnancy test. If you're having sex, which is what you're telling me, you are at risk for all of these other diseases. It's not just pregnancy. And I think the other big myth that they have, which I find fascinating, is even the college girls would come in and we'd go through the same thing, and I say, well, your test is negative, but now you need an OBGYN, you need to have a pap smear, you need blood tests, you need to be tested for STD. And these girls would be like, well, I was drunk. I'm like, did you think herpes asks now? Excuse me, are you sober or, you know, or drunk? Because we only infect sober people. I mean, just because you're drunk does not mean that the consequence of the decision or lack of the decision, but the consequence of having sex is going to be any less or not there. And so I think there's just this kind of, the biggest myth for kids is just that they think I can do these things, either I'm copying the behavior I'm seeing from the media or I'm doing what everybody else seems to be doing, and this disease won't happen to me, or this consequence won't happen to me. And part of the problem is it's not tattooed to their forehead. I mean, 1 in 4 students in the United States is infected with an STD. The problem is you can't see it. So if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. As long as when they get up the next morning, if they don't feel like they have a symptom, then they're not infected. And the reality is very different. And a lot of these students are infected and they don't even know it.
Who has the highest HPV rate, human papillomavirus rate? 15 to 20-year-olds, 20 to 24-year-olds, or 25 to 27-year-olds? What do you think?
25 to 27?
Close, 20 to 24-year-olds. 26.8% are infected. I'll tell you what, between 20 and 24, you don't have much of a chance. You really don't. Statistics show it. In a minute, you'll find out why.
Right now, in the United States, sexually transmitted disease is a huge epidemic. We have probably, you have 14,000 teenagers infected every day. When we include the college population through about age 22, we have 38,000 newly infected students every day. If you would have graduated from high school in 1967, 1 in 32 of your classmates would have been infected with an STD. I mean, you would have had to have had a few partners before you came in contact with it. If you would have graduated with me in 1982, 1 in 18 of my classmates was infected. Today, it's 1 in 4. 1/4 of our kids is infected. So it does not take that, you know, you have 2 partners and you've been exposed to STD. That's all it takes. And so that's really the problem.
How many people are infected with genital herpes? There's no cure. It's called HSV, HPV, human papillomas, HSV, genital herpes. 45 million, 55 million, or 62 million Americans? What do you think?
Second option, 52.
45 million.
45.
Yeah. Not as bad as you thought. You're from Brazil, aren't you?
Yeah.
I love your accent. It's great. How many people are infected when the Bible says, avoid sexual immorality, for it's the one sin you commit against your body? You know why I like statistics? It lets me see people. I don't look at statistics. When I see these statistics, I see young people. People I meet all the time.
What's the big deal about STDs? Aren't they curable? STDs are a big deal. If you get one, it's a viral infection, you may have it for life. If you get one and it's a bacterial infection, we may treat the bacteria and cure it, but the effects may still be in your body, such as gonorrhea and chlamydia can cause pelvic inflammatory disease, which may make it impossible for you to get pregnant in the future. Viral infections sometimes can be released by your body, but if they're not, then you have those infections for life.
How many people are infected with genital herpes over 11 years old? 1 in 5.